Hi, I'm Mark Bayley, Head of Development here at The Genealogist. I build the tools that help you break down your brick walls. In today's talk, Fleshing Out the Bones, I'll be discussing some of the record collections that can tell you more about your ancestors' lives. So we'll start off with a couple of record sets that will be familiar with you, and then we'll take it from there. Let's start with Census. So Census was taken every 10 years from 1801 onwards. But it was only from 1841 where we can access census that has usable information for us, where they recorded names and addresses and occupations and things. Here's an example of my great-great-grandfather, George Bayley, in the 1891 census. Now, every census you access before 1911, you can see black and white images of enumeration books. However, in the 1911 census, you'll notice a difference. For the first time, you can access colour images, and these are household returns. That means these are records filled out by the head of each household, and they include the signature of the head of the household too at the bottom right-hand corner of the page. Now, because these are filled out by the heads of the households rather than the enumerators, they tended to add a bit of extra information on that wasn't officially required. For example, here we have the record for William and Dora Cope. Now, they've written down all the names of the children that were born to them. But the enumerator has come across and struck through the names of the children that had unfortunately died before the census, and had written the word dead next to them. This happened quite often in the census, so you can often find families with extra individuals that you can add to your tree that were never known to you before, because the enumerator would have obviously never have written these names down in the first place. But there's plenty of other extra information that our ancestors have added on these documents. Another example is John Underwood, who had really interesting infirmities listed for all the family members. He said of himself as having a bad temper, his wife a long tongue, and his children were quarrelsome, stubborn, greedy, vain, and noisy. A sailor, Edward Keeley, said his birthplace was at sea on a dark and stormy night, sir. And Leslie Gordon Payne had written down all of his details in pencil first, and left the pencil annotation of what he thought about his marriage status as single, thank God, there for you to find in the original records. Now, we doubled the resolution and doubled the quality of the 1911 census when we added it to the genealogist, so you can really zoom in and see those fine pencil markings. Now, if you want to move forwards from 1911, unfortunately there was no 1931 or 1941 census. The 31 census was destroyed due to a fire, and the 41 census was cancelled due to the Second World War breaking out. But the 1939 register was a national identity registration program recording everybody in the country in September of 1939. There's over 34 million records available to search through, and much like Census, you can search these records using a name, address, keywords, or family members. Now, interestingly, although you only get the age in a census record, the 1939 register actually records the full date of birth, so you get a bit of more information there as well. And also, the 1939 register later became the National Health Service register, and it was a living document. So people would edit the 1939 register as details changed. For example, when women married and changed their surname, the documents were updated. So you can search for a person's maiden name or their married surname. We don't just have census records for England and Wales, we actually have the Scottish census from 1841 up to 1901 available for you to search too. And there's over 24 million records for you to search through in that collection. And again, just like the other records, you can search through by name, address, and any other sort of keywords. Another record set you'll be familiar with are birth, marriage, and death records. Now, civil registration started in 1837, and after a couple of years it was made a legal requirement to record anyone who was born, married, or died in the country. Yet it's still one of the first brick walls people often hit when researching their ancestors. Why can't you find a particular person's birth, marriage, or death record? Well, let's cover some of the more common reasons. When I recorded my son's birth a few years ago now, I told the person that his name was Thomas Bayley, and they typed it out on the computer. I realised they did use the more common spelling of Bayley, B-A-I-L-E-Y, so I spelled the correct spelling out to them for my spelling, B-A-Y-L-E-Y. But you can imagine this happening back all the way in 1837. If you don't spell the surname out to the person recording it, the registrar, then they'll spell it however they see fit. So try and think about all the various ways you can spell that surname, but still pronounce it the same. That's called phonetic variation. Another reason you might not be able to find your ancestors' birth, marriage, or death is perhaps they're listed on one of those missing pages. Now, before these records were digitized and put online on various websites, you would access birth, marriage, and death records by visiting places like the Family Records Centre in London and paging through huge books looking for your ancestors' birth, marriage, or death record. Eventually, those books were put onto microfiche and microfilm for people to more easily access. And that involves a person sitting at a large machine, turning a page and taking a photograph. It's only human nature to make mistakes. Occasionally, they would turn over 2 pages and miss a couple of hundred people's birth, marriage, or death record. Luckily, we realised this when the Family Records Centre was still open, and we sent up a team to take digital photographs of all those missing pages for you. Another reason might be that your ancestor wasn't actually born, married, or died in the country. They could have been born, married, or died overseas or on a ship. And there's 2 record collections that can help you in that case. There's the GRO, the General Register Office, collection of overseas births, marriages and deaths. They contain things like the Army, the Air Force and the Marine births, marriage and death records, as well as consular birth, marriage and deaths, where British subjects were born, married or died abroad and then registered at the High Commission or the British Consulate. There's a second collection of overseas records though that can help you, and that's the National Archives collection. This includes things like RG32, including prisoner of war and civilian deaths. RG33 contains overseas births, marriages and deaths, as well as burials of British subjects on board ships. RG34 contains foreign marriages during the First World War. RG35 contains the foreign death returns, and RG36 contains births, marriages and deaths in the British protectorates, places like Africa and Asia. Then you also have birth, marriage and death records at sea, and that's found in the Board of Trade series BT 158 to 160. And all of these record sets, including the ones I'll be talking about in the future in this talk, are all available on the Genealogist. If you've exhausted those 2 collections, I'd recommend looking at passenger lists. For example, BT 27 are outgoing passenger lists between 1890 and 1960. There's 24.5 million records to look through there. Now, I recommend passenger lists because an ancestor may have travelled abroad and had a baby in another country and registered it within their record collections, rather than going to the British Consulate or the High Commission and registering there. So, for example, if you have a great-great-grandfather who went away to America with his wife, and whilst over in America they had a baby and eventually came back, you may not know this through the records, but you'll be able to find them in the BT27 passenger lists going out to America, and that shows you where you'd want to look for your ancestors' birth record. And finally, perhaps they changed their name. As in this case, Lord Byron, officially he had to change his surname to Noel to inherit half of his mother-in-law's estate. And to do that, there's a few places that you would need to publicise your change of name in if you did it officially. And we have those record collections also available to search on the site. You can do it as a private Act of Parliament, as in Lord Byron's case, or you could announce it in places like the London Gazette. If you're still struggling, try and think outside the box. There's other records that can indicate person's births, marriages and deaths, for example, baptism records, or if you're looking at deaths, headstone records. So we also have a volunteer project that we run in partnership with ukindexer.co.uk. You can go to that site to find out more about our volunteer projects. Now, we have these volunteer projects to go out and photograph your local cemetery and transcribe the headstones, and in return you can earn points towards subscriptions to the Genealogist or products from genealogysupplies.com. Headstones are great for us genealogists because they often include much more information than an official death record. They can contain other family members listed and all sorts of interesting details. So going from outside in the cemetery to into the church now, we also have church parish records, Church of England parish records, that is. We have 4 different types. We have our own transcripts of parish records. We have images of some churches where we can get permission from the local church to release those. We have societies and other volunteer organisations' transcripts of parish records. And we have Victorian transcripts, such as the complete Phillimore collection available on the site. Now, the Church of England parish records are only about half the story. The religious census of 1851 found about half of the country actually visited a non-conformist chapel of worship. So when you're looking before civil registration, before 1837, and you're looking for parish records, bear in mind that you also want to look at non-conformist records, such as RG4, which contained all the sorts of non-Church of England denominations that you're commonly aware of, people like the Baptists, Independents, Presbyterians, Wesleyans, Roman Catholics, even Protestant refugees that have fled to the country, would all be in RG4 and RG5. This is part of the bigger collection of records from the National Archives known as non-parochial and non-conformist record sets. They also include RG8, which the National Archives call miscellaneous records, but they include the Russian Orthodox Church, the Chapel Royale, so royal baptisms, marriages and burials, and also Holborn Hospital's maternity records, which are really interesting to look through because they also include the baptisms of the children, because the chapel was actually attached to the church and the two records were combined in one document. RG6 are also a non-conformist record set. These are Quaker records. Over 1.3 million individuals are listed within these, and they cover roughly the same sort of period as parish records, from 1570s up to the 1840s. Now, Quakers didn't just record one or two witnesses to a wedding, they recorded the whole congregation. So fantastic news for genealogists. RG7 are known as clandestine marriages, or you may have heard these be referred to as fleet marriages. These, again, services performed in local chapels, not Church of England churches. But it became such a popular place to get married that actually local pubs and other public buildings were used to perform these ceremonies. So the Fleet was a debtor's prison in London, but these services were also performed at places like the King's Bench prison, the Mint, the Mayfair Chapel as well. And they're available to anyone that paid the fee, basically. There was no real rules or regulations as you would find with normal Church of England parish records. So there's no need to have a marriage license or have your banns read beforehand. You could literally turn up on the day with your girlfriend on your arm and get married there and then for a very cheap fee. So it became a very popular place to get married. In fact, over half the marriages in London between the mid-16 and mid-1700s were actually performed as one of these clandestine services. So if you can't find your ancestor getting married in London or the home counties, I'd really recommend you check out the RG7 collection. Now, if you want to find your ancestors before parish records began in the 1500s, there's a few record collections that can help you there. And one of those is will records. Now, wills go back to about 1384, and we have the will records all the way up to 1858. There's a certain hierarchy within the wills. You have the peculiar lower courts that just settled very low value wills, or if you had over this sort of threshold value, or if you had multiple properties, your will would be proven in one of the two higher courts. Those were the Prerogative Court of Yorkshire, which covered the Midlands and the North, or the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, which covered the south of the Midlands, including all of Wales. And the Prerogative Court of Canterbury was the highest court of all. It had a certain sort of prestige associated with it. So a lot of people did ask for their will to be proven in Canterbury just to have that sort of prestige. So here's just a quick example of looking through the Prerogative Court of Canterbury collection. We also have indexes to the Prerogative Court of York and those smaller, many of those smaller county peculiar courts as well. So here I'm looking for William Shakespeare's will, and not only do we show you the index for the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, but we actually managed to have the images as well. So you can see word for word what your ancestor wrote in that will. It's really interesting to see the kind of furniture they owned, the properties they had, the kind of occupation they had, relatives that they list, who's getting what belongings, who they favoured. And we even found a stipulation written in one of these wills saying, my daughter Jane can have half of the estate, as long as she no longer sees John. Little does he know that John and Jane had just plopped down the Fleet to get married, but that's another story. If you have a black sheep in the family tree, you'd be interested in looking through our criminal records. We have a huge amount of different variety of records, from criminal charges, pardons, criminal lunatics as they were known back then, hulk and prison registers. We even have the Metropolitan Habitual Criminals and Drunkards, where these pictures are from. And I really recommend looking through these if you think you have an ancestor that may have committed a crime, even if you think it's just a misdemeanor, because the crimes back in the times of these records were dished out with really harsh sentences. For example, we have a William Warren who was accused of stealing a pint of peas. Now, he was found not guilty, but William Mason, just the next record below, was accused of stealing a skittle ball. Now, you can think, popping down the pub, playing some skittles with his friends, he thought it'd be a great laugh to take that skittle ball home as a memento from winning the night, perhaps. Well, in the morning when he woke up, he was found guilty of stealing that skittle ball, and he was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia. So you can see these really harsh punishments dealt out for really low misdemeanors. We have a huge variety of military records available on the site, including the largest collection of Army and Navy lists available online. We also have the First and Second World War death records. We have rolls of honour, which are really interesting, listing mainly officers that have died in the First and Second World War. And they usually contain a little biography and even sometimes a photograph, so you can see your ancestor staring back at you on the screen. We also have casualty records. Now, the statistics from the First and Second World War are pretty horrific. Over 700,000 British soldiers died fighting in the First World War. Over 170,000 were captured as prisoners of war. 100,000 were reported missing, and over 1.6 million British soldiers were injured during the conflict. And here you can see a casualty list record from my great-great-grandfather John Robson, who kept the piece of shrapnel that went in his arm as a memento. It took about 6 weeks for the reports to come from the front line to being published in the casualty lists. So from the date of this record, I can tell that John was injured in early August. If your ancestor performed an act of gallantry or good deed, or perhaps had a number of years of good service, perhaps they'd be entitled to one of these medals. We have a huge medal collection available for you to search through on the site, including things like the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Service Order and the Conduct Medal, the Military Medal, the Tutorial Force Efficiency Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, which actually came with a financial reward as well, which is interesting to find. And also, if they were just mentioned in dispatches, they'd be entitled to wear an oak leaf emblem and would be able to be found within these records as well. It's important to note that these are records of entitlement, so your ancestor didn't need to actually claim the medal for you to be able to find the record. If they had unfortunately died before they claimed the medal, or they didn't want to claim that medal, they'd still be found within these records. However, if your ancestor wasn't awarded one of these gallantry medals, perhaps you'll be able to find them in our campaign medal collection. Now, if your ancestor was in a theatre of war overseas during the First World War, they'll be entitled to one or more of these medals, including the 1914 Star, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal. There's over 5.5 million records in this collection, and again, these are records of entitlement, so they didn't need to actually claim that medal, they'd still be listed within the record collection if they were entitled. So going over to the RAF, we actually have the Operations Records books, which are a really interesting collection. There's over 13.5 million records from as early as 1911 up to 1961. They cover not just the Royal Air Force, but also Dominion and Allied squadrons within these records as well. And there's two sorts of forms within this record. There's the 540 forms, which were summaries of the events that happened, and also the form 541, which were details of the work carried out. They listed the people involved, so the pilots, navigators, etc. They give you the squadron the person was flying in, their rank, the date, the time, the place, both from where they set off from and where they landed. And they can give you a detail of what was going on during that flight, whether it was a recce mission or an attack or even just defence. Now moving on to something completely different with tithe records. Now tithings were where you gave a tenth of your produce to the local clergy, and this had been going on for centuries. In fact, it was made a compulsory tithing by King Offa of Mercia in the year 794. Now our tithe records cover the period from 1836 up to 1936. Now in 1836, the government decided that we should move to a monetary payment system rather than giving payment in kind. For example, a tenth of your cattle or a tenth of your crop that you'd grown. That's why we have these tithe barns that still stand today, where the church would put all the produce in to store it. So like I say, in 1836, the government decided to move to a monetary system, and to do that they needed to survey the whole country to make it fair to determine what value tithe rent that people would have to pay, which is great for us genealogists because it's a nationwide survey before the first census available to us. So they recorded every landowner and every land occupier in the country, and it therefore covers both sides of society, from your high-up landowning aristocracy to your lowly tenant farmers. Like I say, they recorded the names of the occupier and the landowner, the size of the land in acres, rods and perches, what the land was used for, and a description of that area or address. Here's just a quick example of looking at Studham in Bedfordshire. Now you can see there the landowner listed as the trustees of the Bridgewater estate, and the occupier is Thomas Gadsden. Now you can see there's another number I haven't mentioned yet. It's a plot number, so plot 55 in this case. It's known as the Great 18 Acres. In the description, it's actually not 18 acres, it's 19 acres, 3 rods and 3 perches according to the survey. But that plot number, plot 55, is really useful because it refers to the actual tithe map, which we also have available on the website. And this is displayed in our map interface called Map Explorer. And if you want to know more about Map Explorer, I'd recommend coming along to my other talk, Mapping Your Ancestors, at another point in the day. So when you bring up the map on the screen, you can actually zoom right in and see exactly where that point is. And you can change the transparency from the tithe map to see a modern day map beneath it. And you can see there that it's actually the location where Whipsnade Zoo stands today. In fact, it's the Elephant House. So like I say, these are tithe records from 1836. But if you want to move forwards in time, we have another collection of land and property records from 1910 that was conceived by this person. Now, David Lloyd George needed to raise income for the inland revenue. And to do that, he wanted to introduce a new tax based on the increase in people's property over time due to government spending on infrastructure. For example, building railways, improving road networks, and things like that. And the idea was that they would survey the whole of the country, and then when you come to sell your property or it's inherited at a later point in time, they would have a look at what government spending has increased the value of your property, and they would charge you a tax percentage on that increase in value as a new tax to like I say, raise funds. Now this means that a very detailed survey was carried out in 1910 and was updated up to 1915. So you have about 5 years of a living record. And for every single property in the country, there are 4 pages of information about that property: who owned it, who was occupying it, the amount charged for rent, the insurance rates. There's a description of room by room what was in the house and the state of the house. If there's any outbuildings or any land attached to that property as well. So you get a huge amount of information. But just like tithe records, these records have a plot number as well that refer to a map. In this case, for the Lloyd George Domesday records, they are hand annotated Ordnance Survey maps that have been highlighted in colour and, like I say, numbered by the original surveyors of the time. And they're really detailed, so you can zoom right in to see a property by property location. And these are also available on Map Explorer, so you can change the opacity and see the modern day map to see if that place still exists. So the records here were for the Queen Hotel in Olney in Buckinghamshire, and the Queen Hotel still does stand today. This is a huge project that we're currently undertaking at the National Archives, conserving and digitising all of these records. It's about 4 times the size of the 1911 census, and we aim to complete it in the next few years. Currently available is the whole of Greater London, the whole of Buckinghamshire and the whole of Berkshire, but keep an eye out as we're releasing more and more home counties over the coming months. Now, like I say, these are added to our Map Explorer interface, and it means that you can change the opacity and slide back to see the original, the modern day map, or in this case, satellite image. So it's really useful to see where your ancestral home stands today. Now, we have huge amount of records available on the website, so I haven't got time to go into them all in detail, but just to give you an idea of what else is available for you to find out about your ancestors. We have poll and electoral records, trade and residential directories, occupational lists covering things like doctors, apprentices, railway workers, pilots, teachers, law lists, actors, clergy, even the criminal records I mentioned. We have newspapers and magazines, things like the Illustrated London News, the Great War magazine, and also we've just started digitising the Times newspapers as well. So you can see the 1880s of the Times newspapers available on the site. We have regimental records and histories, telephone directories, pedigrees, visitations, peerage and heritage records. If you have blue blood in you, you can trace your way back to about 850 AD with our royal records. We have international records and, of course, immigration and immigration records too. Now, we have a special offer on today for All About That Place, where you can save on a diamond subscription to the genealogist. Now, it's £95 or just under £95 a year with our lifetime discount, so the price will never increase for as long as you stay with us. And we're also able to give you a 12-month subscription to Discover Your Ancestors online magazine, so you'll get a new issue each month. It's full of interesting articles and research tips and advice. So if you'd like to take us up on that offer, visit thegenealogist.co.uk/AATP23, and that link will be in the various advertising and research guide that you should have downloaded as part of this course. Well, thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.